Hey everybody, it's Jenna. Thunderbolts is officially in theaters. I got a chance to see it early, and my Phase Hero co-host and I got to record an episode about it at IMAX headquarters, which was so cool and such an honor. Thank you to IMAX for helping set that up. I thought the movie was great. And no, I am not just saying that in the immediate afterglow. I respect every single decision that it makes, and I think it results in an energy that feels so fresh and so scrappy while also being surprisingly emotional. I already have an entire separate video brewing in my head about what this movie has to say about trauma and grief, but today I wanted to talk about one particular thing that quickly stood out to me as I watched it. The way that government oversight and militarization have gone hand in hand, for better or for worse, with a lot of the MCU. This is not meant to be the definitive history of superhero stories and their relationship with the military and the government, because that could honestly be hours long and encompass so many examples. There are entire tangents to be had about superheroes and patriotism, about superheroes whose origin stories are intrinsically tied to a role in the military, and about superheroes who decide to go one step further and join the government in a civilian role, a topic I did make a video about a few months ago. As it is, I have a hunch that this comment section is going to be filled with people pointing out certain characters or story arcs that they're shocked I didn't mention, but that's not the point. The point is that when you look at the trends of the past near century of superhero comics versus the trends of the past near 20 years of the MCU, you see some interesting patterns. While there are obviously some exceptions and an entire subgenre of war comics that dealt directly with a real-world infrastructure that's similar to our own, superhero comics themselves largely took a very different approach to authority than the MCU has. The Golden Age was best known for its outlandish gimmicks and its mystery men, with many of its superheroes ignoring or often being an enemy of any law enforcement that was in their orbit. Even Superman, whose arrival literally set the gold standard for the modern superhero, made his feelings towards police officers abundantly clear. There was definitely still a sense of patriotism, largely to motivate young readers to contribute however they could to the war effort of World War II, but superheroes largely operated by their own moral compass, as opposed to some sort of government infrastructure. With the Silver Age, the broader trend shifted towards sci-fi escapism, and new teams of heroes forming not because they were told to by anybody, but because they knew they could do more work as a collective. That status quo essentially bled into the Bronze Age, which then provided plenty of opportunities to showcase parts of counterculture or call attention to people's internal biases. When any sort of real-world bureaucracy did come up, it was either hand-waved away as a special arrangement with the government or turned into an ironic plot point that the superheroes couldn't punch their way out of. The comics of the 80s and 90s might be known for their deconstructive or gritty exteriors, but they also found their own ways to bake in a challenging of government and authority. A hero might work alongside law enforcement to gain information, but that was usually a cordial to adversarial partnership, and they never fully answered to them. Even the stories about teams that were sanctioned by some sort of omnipotent government, like Watchmen's Crime Busters or the Justice League International, still circled back around to arguing that corruption or a cataclysmic squid attack can render all of that meaningless in an instant. The turning point for comics, for what would become the MCU, and for a large part of our popular culture was the early 2000s and the fallout from 9/11. In addition to heartfelt tributes blurring the line between these fictional worlds and our own, comics themselves trended towards patriotism and government structure amid uncertain times. This included Marvel's initial run of the Ultimate Universe, which aimed to not only provide a major jumping on point for potential new readers, but recontextualize the characters and their gimmicks and their relationships in this new modern age. The centerpiece of this was the Ultimates, an update of the Avengers who are brought together not as a team that operates with its own autonomy, but as high-profile government employees. While the intent behind the book is debated still to this day, with writer Mark Millar subsequently arguing that the team structure was satirical and anti-war, it still directly influenced the way that the Avengers were assembled on screen. Under the authority of S.H.I.E.L.D., they were essentially government contractors, and mostly strangers to each other, not heroes who were aware of and respected each other's respective work and who genuinely wanted to be teammates with each other. Sure, they could go rogue in their methods of saving the day, but at the end of the day, the government directly reaped the benefits of them doing so. As Marvel Studios' Kevin Feige explained in a 2012 interview, quote, "The Ultimates was an amazing reinvention of the Avengers. Mark Millar and Joe Quesada sat down more than 10 years ago and said, quote, if we had to reinvent the Avengers universe today, what would we do? How would we change it? So they were asking and answering the same questions we always do when we have to start to make a movie." The main Marvel Comics universe also spent the 2000s trekking a similar sort of path, with New Avengers and Civil War and Secret Invasion and Dark Reign, which I'll talk more about in a minute, blurring the line between being a superhero for the love of the game and a superhero when and how the government wants you to be. Other comics and superhero media started to follow suit. It absolutely bled over into the subsequent movies of the MCU, as evident by the still ongoing debate about which team was right in the Civil War movie. It also became part of the DNA of franchises like the Arrowverse and Superman and Lois, regardless of whether or not its characters had dealt with military in the comics, and a more heightened part of the DNA of The Boys. Sometimes this government government oversight would be used to create an extra narrative structure or conflict or even comedic effect.
I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it.
But as these projects help superhero stories reach a more mainstream audience, I think a part of the audience started subconsciously expecting checks and balances and red tape and obstacles rooted in our reality instead of self-governing escapism. As comic creator and current CCO of DC Comics Jim Lee put it in 2005, quote, "In some ways, the government is our new version of radiation. Radiation used to be the reason why people got superpowers, now the government is." This brings me to Thunderbolts the movie. I remember being surprised when the movie was first announced at its roster. It entirely consisted of a bunch of characters who shoot and punch and use shields in a fight, largely as covert agents of various governments or organizations, instead of as public-facing superheroes. It turns out the movie was well aware of these similarities and decided to have a lot of fun with them. The group is assembled in the movie because of government oversight, but not in a typical way, as CIA Director Valentina manipulates them all into being in the same room so she can cut her losses and kill them for the sake of her credibility. She doesn't even think that they'd make a good team together and is genuinely surprised when they start to be one, because she views them and their roles in the superhero community as expendable. The characters view themselves as expendable too. They haven't really known a life outside of what the government has given them, skills or superpowers, in exchange for doing increasingly dark and messy work. If they do have a life outside of that, it's filled with pain and listlessness and trauma, so they try their best to outrun it, each in their own different way. Yelena drinks while wondering if she can be good enough to follow in her sister's footsteps and become a public-facing superhero. Bucky tries to do good in the bureaucracy of Congress, only to discover just how much his hands are tied by red tape and packets. Also, shout out to Wendell Pierce for a delightful supporting performance in this movie. And even John Walker, a character who completely grew on me over the course of this movie, attempts to hide his flaws and his losses behind a laundry list of silly accomplishments. So, over the course of the movie, these characters bond over a common goal of stopping Valentina, in part because they don't want to see Bob turned into her and the government's latest weapon, but they also bond over their humanity, their similar traumas and complicated pasts, and their shitty attitudes towards themselves. This team could have easily been portrayed as a stone-cold hit squad following orders from the government who butt heads even more than the Avengers did in 2012. Instead, they become a found family that actively chooses to stick together because they know that it's the right thing to do, for each other and for themselves. There are so many unapologetically human moments that really elevate this movie for me. Them casually showing off their superhero gadgets to each other, comforting each other as their repressed pain and trauma comes up in the third act, or even saving civilians on a micro-personal level. I even love the origin of why they call themselves the Thunderbolts, because it represents the autonomy that they're starting to have over themselves. Borrowing the name from Yelena's youth soccer team is so much more human than being given the name because of Thunderbolt Ross, especially considering how messy his legacy currently is in the MCU. That through line of agency and humanity can also be seen with Bob, whose storyline definitely conveys the weirdness of Sentry's origin in the comics, which involves bizarre hoaxes and untold histories. Check out the video I made earlier this year if you want to know more, while also tying in something new. For the sake of time, and for not attempting to gaslight people over Sentry being at the Battle of New York or something, I think it was great to have the creation of Sentry be a government program that Bob volunteers for. It felt like a relic of something that would have been hidden in plain sight in the early days of the MCU. It also let us and the Thunderbolts become endeared to him as a person instead of as a superhero, which then helps make the media circus and over-designed costume and orders that Valentina gives him feel even more off. He even acknowledges the fact that if he's supposedly more powerful than all of the original 6 Avengers combined, he shouldn't need to be taking orders from the government. While that could have easily been a heel turn for Bob to be a ruthless villain, his humanity wins out at the end of the day. He has more control over the Sentry and Void sides of him than he realizes, and he's able to make the choices not to kill his newfound friends. Even the final twist of the movie, that the Thunderbolts have accidentally stumbled into being publicly unveiled as Valentina's government-sponsored new Avengers, subverted every single expectation that I had. Sure, I've spent the better part of the past year wondering if the movie was going to take a page out of Dark Reign, which sees Norman Osborn, under the instruction of the US government, rebooting the Thunderbolts into a team of public-facing, but secretly morally ambiguous anti-heroes and villains, who eventually become known as the Dark Avengers. But it was honestly so refreshing to see that the tables had turned, and that it's actually Yelena and the team who have power over Valentina, who needs to have the team do well for the sake of her reputation and her legal standing. Based on what we see in the mid-credits and post-credit scenes, it seems like any strong government oversight is eclipsed by the goofy, incredibly human things that the team actually wants. Public glory, silly matching costumes, a comfortable headquarters in the old Avengers Tower, and sponsorships with Wheaties and dozens of other brands. It almost expands the idea of a government superhero team to the point of bursting its bubble entirely. Even if they are getting government funding, these goobers are still going to do whatever they want anyway, and we know that they are good enough people to not use that agency for something evil. To me, it feels very reminiscent of the Justice League International, and not just because Booster Gold also has a history of corporate sponsorships on his costumes. That reveal works so well for me, not only for the characters' arcs, but for the past few years of the MCU. There is obviously a lot that can and will continue to be said about the multiverse saga and the various creative decisions that were made or changed within it. But one pattern has emerged for me. In the absence of a government-aided or government-controlled Avengers roster, the disparate heroes of the MCU have gotten a lot better at just being superheroes because they know that it's the right thing to do, and teaming up with each other because they know that they're stronger together than by themselves. And honestly, that message hits harder both in our current real-world landscape and in the political landscape of the MCU, which has given multiple very good reasons just within the past couple years for why its government isn't really trustworthy. The last president declared war on the Skrulls, only for that to never be followed up on. His successor turned into a giant red monster and had to be thrown in an offshore prison, and the current mayor of one of the biggest cities in the world has declared martial law and thrown people in cages. The arc of the Thunderbolts turned New Avengers seems to recognize the flaws in the government-sponsored machine, even in mundane ways like Bucky getting frustrated by packets and red tape. And honestly, whatever happens within the superhero community and the Avengers as a concept by the end of Doomsday and Secret Wars will probably render that machine obsolete anyway. On that note, I also love that the post-credit scene reveals that these new Avengers are seemingly the first team in the main universe to become aware of the Fantastic Four, and I honestly want them to be the first team that they meet too, because they feel like a perfect contrast to the FF's hopeful, unabashedly heroic standing in their own universe. I feel like the FF are going to see the messy status of things in the main universe and be like,
"You guys are in a crisis. I'm on my way."
Which would be a great way to get the gears turning towards a post-Secret Wars MCU that meshes their two sensibilities and universes together. Yes, there will always be superhero stories that go hand in hand with the government and the military, and there should be, as an outlet to tackle the positives and negatives of that relationship. But that relationship does not work for every single character, and in the process, giving it to every single character loses some of the magic and heart and fantastical nature that makes superhero stories so special. As Grant Morrison put it in their 2011 book Super Gods, quote, "A child can accept all kinds of weird-looking creatures and bizarre occurrences in a story because the child understands the stories have different rules that allow for pretty much anything to happen. Adults, on the other hand, struggle desperately with fiction, demanding constantly that it conform to the rules of everyday life." I think our recent superhero media, even at its most grounded, has started to inch away from that dichotomy and more towards the much-needed escapism. You can have your own personal preference as to whether or not you want that, but I honestly think it's absolutely necessary to keep the medium going amid all of the complaints of superhero fatigue. In its own way, I think Thunderbolts understands that, and my hope is that it plays a major role in cracking that status quo going forward. We don't love the Thunderbolts because they're a bunch of characters who have a similar gimmick to Captain America, who, even then, has his own history with butting heads with the government. We love them because they're complicated and endearing individuals who go on adventures that we can't even imagine, which should be the approach to superhero storytelling always, but especially going forward. What did you think of Thunderbolts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you haven't already done so. Merch is available at the link in the description. As I mentioned at the top of the video, our Phase Hero episode reviewing the movie from IMAX HQ will be dropping later this weekend. As always, you can find me on social media at Hey It's Jenna Lynn. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, go read some comics.